Hi everybody, I think we're good to go. Thank you for joining for today's webinar. My name's Andrew Goodman and I'm one of the key account managers at LexisNexis Enterprise Solutions, and today I'm joined by James Watts from Data Barracks. This session today is a really hot topic, both inside and outside the legal industry. I was just actually reading the other day on the BBC website that ransomware and cyber criminals were estimated to have cost UK businesses over £4.5 million last year. Clearly, it's gaining traction and it's a real threat to our users. So we've invited Data Barracks along today to talk about the subject and then discuss potential options you have to actually combat this threat. Once again, thank you for joining today, and I'll now pass you across to James for this half-hour session. James.
Good afternoon and welcome to How to Recover from Ransomware. Yes, so my name is James Watts. I'm here from Data Barracks, and just to start with, I want to highlight exactly this issue of ransomware. Only this weekend, we in fact had 3 of very large customers all suffering from ransomware infection. So this is definitely a hot topic and something that's worth us paying a lot of attention to. So to start with, I want to look at just do a bit of housekeeping. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be 30 minutes in duration, which includes time for Q&A. So any questions, please pop those in the column on the right hand side. We shall endeavour to answer those. And to answer the first question, as always on any webinar, yes, we shall distribute these slides and the recording after, so don't feel you need to scribble anything down. So firstly, I want to run through what it is that we're going to be covering today. So we're going to be looking at how ransomware works and why it is breaching organizational defenses. We're going to look at the best methods for prevention. We're going to then look at incident management, crisis management and your escalation process, and then a step-by-step guide to recovery. So in 3 points there: prevention, mitigation, and then recovery itself. So first, actually, before I get into the detail of the session today, usually I would leave this to the end, but I think because it's so relevant for what we're talking about, what we're covering, I think it's worth mentioning it now. So earlier this year, we launched the BCPCast, so a business continuity podcast. It's covering all those topics, so resilience, cybersecurity, and recovery. If you're interested in all of that, you'll certainly be interested in this. And in fact, one of our most recent episodes was on cybersecurity, but particularly from a continuity angle. So do take a look. We've got it's genuinely a very interesting listen. We've got some really interesting folks on from the Economist Group, BP, Fujitsu, London 2012 Olympics, going through all of their challenges and how they deal with them. So you can find that at thebcpcast.com, or you can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. So to start with, ransomware. So in order for us to know how we can prevent it, how we can mitigate, and how we can recover, we need to have a kind of a fundamental understanding of what it is and how it works. So to kick off with there, I'm going to use a very, very broad definition that hopefully will cover all of the various different variants that we could be including. So that is, it is malware that affects your system until you pay a ransom. Now, there are broadly 2 types of ransomware. You have the locker or locking types of ransomware, which will deny access to a computer or device, anything that's infected, but it won't actually affect the underlying data. The second variant is crypto, which means it'll encrypt that data. So in that instance, you will be paying a ransom to buy the encryption key. And what that will do is it'll then give you access to your data again. Payment will usually take the form of a cryptocurrency, so something like Bitcoin, and the cost will vary, but it can be as little as $200, or it could be in the region of thousands of dollars. Now, recent research from Trend Micro suggested that the average amount that organizations will pay is £540. Now, That is increasing. As the major trend that we're seeing is there is an increase in targeting, and that value is going up. Um, in most of the cases, anecdotally that I know of, where people have paid the ransom, they have then been able to get their data back. But that isn't the case. So in that same piece of research from Trend Micro, they're reporting that actually only a fifth of those who do pay the ransom do get their data back. So that means there are no guarantees. You need to have a recovery strategy in place. Now, the most common attack vector at the moment, and certainly the one I think we all tend to think of when we think of ransomware, is that the attack vector is coming through email. But it's certainly the most popular, but it isn't the only method of attack. It's malware. It could be coming through any of those traditional methods. So it could be malvertisements. It could be compromised websites. Any of those other methods. But for now, we will predominantly be looking at how you protect from it coming in through email. So a couple of quick facts to note before we go further. So the encryption is to all intents and purposes unbreakable. Perhaps not to our friends at the NSA or GCHQ, but for the rest of us in our regular working lives, we will not be able to break that encryption. The file names will be changed so that it isn't possible for us to, for instance, isolate particularly significant data. And there's going to be a deadline for payment. There's going to be an ultimatum for us to take action, which forces us to do something, which is either, in the case of the cyber criminal, what they want obviously is to make that payment, or for us to perform some kind of recovery. So that's what it is. I think it's probably worth at this point taking a quick look at why this has suddenly become such a significant issue, and who's being targeted. So I'll start with why. Ransomware isn't new. It has been around for a long time, but there have been a few factors that have driven this incredible surge that we've seen. No doubt you'll have read a lot more about this in the news. In IT press, we know this is a big issue, and that's if you've not been affected or known of businesses who have been affected, which ultimately will, over time. So the most significant factor that is driving this increase is Bitcoin, and not just Bitcoin, but any of the cryptocurrencies. So if we are to look at cybercrime as a fund on a basic two levels of risk and reward, what cryptocurrencies have enabled cybercriminals to do is to be able to take that payment, but to be able to do so without the risk of being tracked by it. And what that's done is it's kept the reward where it has been for a very long time, but it's dropped that level of risk really significantly, and that's led this enormous surge. So on a similar level in terms of risk and reward, if we look at who is being targeted, now the cybercriminal will they will put their efforts where they're most likely to get a good return. Now, one of the key factors in whether or not you will get a good return from a ransomware attack is, does your victim have a good backup in place? Now, the people who are least likely to have a good backup are going to be consumers. Compared with a business, they're the guys who usually don't have solid backup in place. So for a long time, we saw a lot of targeting towards consumers. Now, on the other hand, a consumer is likely to pay up to a certain amount of money, but they're not going to pay the much higher figures that a business will pay to get access to their data, particularly in what we're seeing now with some very targeted attacks in legal and in healthcare, where the figures are getting into the tens and hundreds of thousands. So what we've now seen then as a result is this shift from targeting consumers to much more significant targeting of businesses, and a kind of a huge upshoot in the total overall volume. So this is how ransomware works. If you are lucky enough to not have ever been infected to this point, this is what it'll look like. You'll get to a screen and it'll say your files are encrypted, you've got this amount of time to take action, and this is how you're going to pay for it. But before the ransomware has reached that point, there's obviously been a lot of work going on in the background, and all of that is the kind of thing that we can look out for. There is some predictable behavior that we can look at to say, okay, is this something we can use to notify us, for us to be able to prevent, to mitigate, and then obviously ultimately to recover. So how does ransomware work? These are the stages that it'll go through. It'll go through the installation, which will be usually that'll be dropped onto your app data or your temp folders in Windows, because those are areas that normal users can write to those directories without admin privileges. There will then be contact with the command and control server. So the ransomware needs to phone home so that it can speak to the server to create the encryption key, which will then be held elsewhere, which is what they're calling you to ransom for. There is a search process checking over the network to see how far it can get and then what it can encrypt, the encryption process itself, and then you're finally seeing that screen, which is here's the ransom. So at each of those stages, there are certain behaviors that we can look at and say, right, is that something we can do anything with? So I want to go through them in order. Installation. So firstly, here ultimately, there are two major ways that you can prevent the installation from occurring at all. Now, the first is it's those fundamental basics. You can have up-to-date anti-spam and anti-malware, all of the security products. That is to prevent the ransomware from being able to get onto your system. But ultimately, we know none of these products are foolproof. There are changes all the time, and ultimately, they're constantly updating their database of certificates. But you may get caught before that happens. So your second line of defense has to be a well-educated workforce, all of your users who know what they're looking for, who aren't clicking on the wrong email and aren't going to those wrong sites. So there's a kind of a two-pronged attack for you to stop it getting on the system. Once you're on and we're at that point of contact, we're looking for contact with command and control. That's a predictable behavior that we know ransomware is going to go through. So there's something we can use to stop there. We can say, let's use some network monitoring to alert us to any suspicious activity. We can look for connection to any known command and control servers. Now, there is an issue with this, and it's difficult to do with ransomware because it'll use a DGA or a domain generation algorithm, which means there isn't a static list of those domains in the malware itself. They're creating it on the fly, so it is more difficult to be able to scan that and check for it. At the search stage, you can look for some certain indicators, but at the encryption stage, there are significant indicators. So what the ransomware is doing there is it is making significant changes to a high number of files. So you might be able to use an anti-ransomware specific tool, and what that'll look for is a high number of read and write operations or a high number of file modifications that are taking place. But in actual fact, you might have something already in place that you would use to monitor that sort of activity, even if you're not using it specifically for this purpose. Now, to use our example as Data Barracks, so we perform online backup services to all of our customers. So for each customer, we will know what a standard incremental backup of a particular server is. We'll be able to say, right, for this server, each night we expect an incremental change of 5 gigabytes of data, and that will take 20 minutes for that to transfer. So we can have alerts set up, and this may be an alert that you have set up to say, actually, I want to keep an eye on that because if suddenly there is a big jump, maybe someone has put more data on the network and I need to know about that. It's going to affect my storage and my backup builds, for instance, or I need to know because it's going to affect the backup window and it's going to push something else out of whack and it'll mean we won't complete in time. So look at anything you have in place that might be looking for that kind of activity, because you may be able to repurpose it for this stage. Now, ultimately, if once you've hit that encryption stage, you're not preventing the attack at all, but you will be preventing the scale of the attack and perhaps being able to stop it being as extensive as it could be. So that's the prevention. Now I want to look at mitigation here. So incident response, crisis management, and escalation. If you speak with the SANS Institute, they have 6 key phases for an incident response plan, which are the stage we have here. So preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and then ultimately the lessons learned. Now that isn't specific to ransomware, so we'll show how this needs to be pulled in for us in this case. So your preparation means you have a written policy on what to do, and that will include communicating and educating the team. So Ransomware can be brought onto your system by any one of your users. So a fundamental needs to be organization-wide, firm-wide education to know what they're looking for and what they should not be doing. Following on from that, you have your written policies. So this says, in this scenario, we take this action. Now, the scenario might be we have ransomware and it is on a laptop, which means you would take a certain course of action. Now, that wouldn't be anything like as significant as if you have ransomware which has affected the entire network. Those policies need to be in place because it's not something that you want to be determining or making up on the fly. Your second stage, so your identification, this is where you're deciding if something really is a significant incident or not. You're making that determination, as we said, of are you enacting this part of the plan or this part of the plan. It may be the case actually that you're being flagged to a suspected piece of ransomware by a user, but it is in actual fact just some standard scareware which can be taken care of quite simply, and a ransom doesn't need to be put in place, and none of those other actions need to be followed. You'll have your containment. So this is the case of how do you stop that ransomware? How do you prevent it? Isolate the access so that it can't do any more damage. You have your eradication, which means restoration of clean data from before that infection. We have the recovery process, which to me this is slightly confusing because in the way that we would talk about recovery as a backup and disaster recovery provider, actually this means not the recovery because we're doing that prior. But this is bringing systems back online into the production environment. And then finally, we go through our lessons learned. In any situation where you've got to this point, something has gone wrong. So it's always important then to look at what went wrong and see how you can fix it. And we're going to look at in a little while the specific areas that you should always be measuring a ransomware attack and how you can improve from that. So that's mitigation. I now want to look in a bit more detail at those two stages. So stages 4 and 5, which are eradication and recovery. And so to completely oversimplify, you've got two choices when you have a ransomware infection. You either pay the ransom or you recover from a backup. Now, as we're a backup and disaster recovery expert, hopefully we can provide a bit of guidance here in terms of the best practice of how you need to be set up in order to do that. So you've been infected. We know we're at that stage now. There's not prevention or mitigation that needs to be going on here. And we need to recover. So you have at this stage two primary objectives. You want to mitigate your data loss, and you want to limit the downtime. And those two objectives are tied very closely to what we use very commonly in our line of work here as your recovery point and your recovery time objectives. So your RPO or your RTO. Now, recovery point, that means how frequently are you backing up or recovering your data? So what point would you go back to in time? The recovery time, so RTO, that means how long does the recovery of the server take when you need to kick off that recovery. So in order for us to recover effectively, we're going to be using one of two methods. We will either have a backup process or we will have our disaster recovery. Now, assuming you are a firm that has both of those processes in place, you might look to choose which you would recover from. Now, replication and disaster recovery isn't optimized to recover from a ransomware attack. The problem you have here is that as soon as that problem hits your production systems, it's immediately replicated across to your replica systems. Now, you can go back through previous versions, you can go through your snapshots, you can look through the replication journal, but replication products traditionally aren't particularly efficient in how well they keep all of those volumes of data. So if you were to keep weeks and weeks of copies, it would mean huge volumes of data that you wouldn't want to pay for. As a result, most people will keep a relatively short window of versions that they can roll back to, which means you go back to your backups. Now that's definitely going to save you because you will have all of those historic versions, but there's two issues here. The first, backups are usually taken less frequently, possibly once per day. So you're going to be recovering from a backup with a longer RPO. RPO will be further back. Now, secondly, the time to recover from your backup will also be longer. So your recovery time objective for recovery from a backup is going to be in the region of hours rather than seconds and minutes if you're recovering from DR. So let's look at a couple of suggestions that we can make to those processes to make sure that you can improve as much as possible. So if we start with recovery point objectives, so the first one, this is a kind of a nice and simple recommendation here, is let's increase the frequency of your backups. For us at Data Barracks, we have the ability for customers to back up file data in continuous data protection, or CDP. Now that means that's backed up in real time. For databases, we can back those up as frequently as 15 minutes. But that's an easy place to start so that you can increase the frequency so you will reduce your recovery point objective. Secondly, you should review and possibly extend your retention policies. Now, there are pieces of ransomware which are specifically designed to outlast a standard business's backup retention schedule. It'll sit around dormant for a period of time before it actually becomes active, encrypts the files, and causes you to pay that ransom. We've personally seen this in some cases. We've seen it with some businesses who've had it sit around for weeks without taking action. So if that is the case for you, you certainly want to extend that to make sure that your window of protection is longer. Now, a lot of businesses will go, for instance, they will have a schedule for their most recent backups. They'll maybe take dailies for a week, weeklies for a month, monthlies for a year. If we went back to the kind of the tape-based grandfather, father, son type retention policy. So what you might find is that beyond a week, your gap is your recovery point objective jumps per week. Certainly, that's the place I'd suggest taking a look at first. Now, in terms of improving your recovery time objective, our first suggestion, this isn't one that's specific to ransomware. It's just something that I think for most businesses you can get a really good improvement for a small amount of effort, and that's always to look at optimizing your connection speed between your target and your recovery environment. So how can you speed up that process when you're pushing a lot of data across? Now, the second point is one that is very specific to ransomware, and that is the problem with ransomware and your recovery time objective. It's not how quickly does it take for you to recover that server. It's how quickly does it take for you to find a clean version of the server. If you're not able to isolate before you start the recovery when the ransomware hit your system, you're going to have to make a lot of different recoveries to try and find when it was the most recent clean version. You can say, right, let's recover from an hour ago. We were infected at that point. Let's go back. Let's recover from 3 weeks ago. We know that's clean. That's fine. But you certainly wouldn't want then to say, okay, let's carry on from data that's 3 weeks old, because you'll have an enormous amount of data loss. What you need to do is you need to find that most recent clean copy, and you need to do that in as quick a method as possible. So it's how can you do that in a ransomware situation, which we'll show you how we approach this in just a second. So looking back at the incident response plan and a couple of these improvements and methods we've suggested, let's run through and we'll say how exactly are we going to go about this. So we've been infected and we go through the identification. So IT needs to be notified by users. We need to confirm the severity of the issue, and we immediately need to start enacting that response plan. Now, this might mean calling in the crisis management team. So, as I said earlier, what's really important here is if this is a significant infection which has affected the entire network, you may need to take very, very significant steps. So it's important that you have people in that team who have the authority to be able to say, right, we're taking the entire network offline, as uncomfortable as that might sound. Containment, containing whether it's your share, your drive, your server, or your entire network. Eradication, recovering of that server or those servers back into a sandbox environment, testing, making sure it's clean. Recovery, bringing out data back online, but being vigilant, making sure it's all fine, and then your lessons learned. So those 3 lessons that I alluded to earlier, it's how did the infection occur? Was it a user error? Was it a failure of a particular piece of technology, and what do we need to do to fix that? How long was IT down, and how much data was lost? So those are the areas that you might want to improve. Now, I mentioned that we have a particular method for this. So each of those bits of best practice that I've mentioned are applicable to any backup or disaster recovery product or strategy that you've got in place. Now, we've taken that and what we've tried to do is apply it to our own product, and we've come up with a new service that we launched earlier this year at the European Legal Security Forum, which combines replication with automated recovery, detection, reporting, and recursive scanning in what we think offers the fastest recovery and the fastest recovery time objectives that are potentially available for a ransomware attack. So I'll show you how this works very briefly. First of all, we are replicating servers, and this is exactly the same as we would do for a standard disaster recovery or replication service. Step 2 is where this changes slightly in that we start performing an automated failover. So we're recovering those servers in the same way that you would do for a test or for a true invocation, but that is a quick recovery. And when we have that data there, we have it in a sandbox environment, so we can immediately start doing something with it. And in this case, what we're going to do is a malware scan. And because it's an offline environment, we're able to scan far more aggressively than you would do in your production environment. We can really check. And ideally, we can be doing this with a different product to what you would be using normally on your production side. So you've got the benefit of having two products, scanning to, two full databases there. And then, assuming everything is good, we will report the status. That gets pinged back to you in an email, and it gets flagged up in your portal to tell you everything is okay. So day to day, all is working very nicely. When you do have an issue, this is where things need to change. So we then have recursive scanning, which is basically our method to find that. It's our method to most quickly find the clean version of your data. So what we might say here is 72 hours ago, we've performed a scan. 48 hours ago, we performed a scan, and 24 hours ago, we performed a scan. Now, at minute 0, we see there's a malware infection. So with that malware infection, it might be that malware was only introduced to the system very recently, or it could be that malware has been present on the system for a long time, but our monitoring product wasn't able to spot it because the database the signatures hadn't been updated. So what we need to do is we need to go back and we need to rescan, knowing what we know now, to see if that malware was present. So first of all, we go back and we scan in the last 24 hours, and we will say, right, is this version of data clean? If it is clean, great, we can start working forward and we can start trying to find when was the malware introduced. And we can do this in an automated way, so this isn't a process that just runs without you needing to take all that action. If we find that actually the malware was present, we need to go even further back, then we go further back. And ultimately, this doesn't prevent the malware from being present on the system, but it speeds up your recovery to getting back up and running in the fastest way possible. So I'm going to finish now with how do you test this? Because ultimately, this the most important thing that we know in continuity and disaster recovery is making sure you're prepared and you know how to go about this. Now, we would always recommend that you're performing a full-scale disaster recovery test at least once per year. So if you have your test coming up and you're scheduling it in now, we definitely recommend making cyber threats, and in particular ransomware, the topic of that test. For larger firms, it might be a really good way for you to bring your cyber teams together, your security teams with your continuity teams. And if it isn't possible for you to do that, perhaps your next annual test is already booked in, it's on a different topic. We would certainly recommend having some smaller scale testing with the key stakeholders, perhaps tabletop testing. So we have previously held a webinar on how you can go about doing that, who needs to be involved. So take a look on our website there for our previous recordings. And we also created a simple tabletop testing simulator with 3 different scenarios that you can recover from. So you have a disaster recovery runbook, and you can work through those stages. One of the particular threats that we looked at was with cyber attacks. So if you want some tips on how you can kind of put yours together, then do take a look there. There'll be some useful resources. So I can see we are tight for time here. We've reached the end of our time, and I'm always very keen to keep to schedule, to respect everyone's afternoon. So I'm afraid we won't go through questions. We'll get back to those separately. But I'll just leave you with if you remember nothing else from today, make sure you have a specific incident response plan for ransomware. And if you do have an incident response plan for ransomware, but it hasn't been updated in a little while, make sure you review that. Also, make sure you go back and review your backup schedules and your retention policies. Those are two things that immediately need to be looked at. And then finally, of course, the only way for you to guarantee that you don't lose your data is with historic copies of that data, be that in backup or disaster recovery. So I've got a couple of links here. These are for the bits that I mentioned earlier and a couple of other interesting articles that I think are probably worth taking a look at. But finally, I'd like to say thank you for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for having us.